Growing up, I lived in a house on the edge of a massive national forest. The forest was dense and wild, and it covered hundreds of square miles. I was captivated by the forest and spent most of my summer exploring it with my friends or by myself. However, I experienced something after my 14th birthday that completely transformed my view of the forest. It all started with a drone. It was the only thing I wanted for my 14th birthday. Not one of the flimsy $50 toys from Walmart, but a high-quality, professional-grade drone for aerial photography and video. The drone I wanted was expensive, but I told my parents I'd pay half, and it could also count as my Christmas present as well. I had always been fascinated by drones, and I had the idea to start a drone photography business, working with local realtors and developers to capture aerial imagery for their listings. When my birthday rolled around, I was thrilled to see my parents walk in carrying a single large box. I unwrapped the present to reveal a Mavic Pro, the top-of-the-line consumer drone at the time. It had an 8-mile range, a flight time of almost 30 minutes, and a camera that could capture 4K video. I couldn't wait to take it into the backyard and fly it over the forest. After quickly scanning the instruction manual and setting up the app on my phone, I ran out my back door to the edge of the forest. I carefully launched the drone, and after a few minutes of getting used to the controls, I guided it into the woods. My parents watched for a few minutes, but the sun was setting and it was starting to cool down, so they went back inside, warning me not to stay out much longer. I stared down at my phone's display, mesmerized by the video feed showing the forest zipping by beneath the drone. I wasn't pushing the drone to its maximum speed of 40 miles per hour, but I was moving pretty fast. I decided to take the drone further into the woods to a part of the forest that was difficult to access on foot due to some rocky terrain and dense brush. My friends and I hadn't spent much time exploring this region, so I was eager to see what was there. Flying my drone over the unknown part of the forest, I saw something moving on the far end of a large open area. I wasn't sure what kind of animals they were due to the distance and dimming light. I guided the drone closer to get a better view. As I got nearer, I could see the animals more clearly, and what appeared on my phone's display made my heart race. These creatures were unlike anything I had ever seen. They were roughly the size of large wolves, but their bodies were completely hairless with shiny, scaly skin. It was almost as if a tiger had been crossed with an alligator. They moved slowly but deliberately through the clearing. It almost looked like they were hunting. Their movements were swift and coordinated. I was terrified, but I couldn't look away. I circled them slowly with the drone, scanning the area for more creatures. As I flew near the edge of the clearing, I noticed a fence in the trees. It was a tall, heavy-duty fence with jagged points. I had seen similar fences outside of military bases. I panned the camera back and forth to get a better look at the fence and saw a section that had been crushed under a massive tree branch. Our area saw an intense storm last week, so the damage was probably recent. I turned my attention back to the creatures and decided to push in closer for a better view. One of the creatures must have heard the drone, stopping to look over its shoulder, its long neck curving backwards into a bizarre U-shape. It turned and began moving in the direction of the drone. Startled, I fumbled with the controls as I tried to pilot the drone away from the advancing creature. In my panic, I backed into a tree, causing the drone to tumble awkwardly before finally coming to a rest in the lower branches. I tried desperately to free the drone, but it was stuck. The drone wasn't pointed directly towards the clearing, but I could still see the creature from before in the corner of my phone's screen. It was slinking slowly towards the drone and was soon joined by 2 others. My pulse quickened. Their movement was fluid and cat-like, yet there was an unnatural quality to their stride. As they drew closer, I got my first good look at the creatures. They were slender but muscular, their bodies covered in fine scales that glimmered in the setting sun. They had large, pointed heads, almost like snakes. Their eyes were shark-like and emotionless. I was gripped with fear, yet I couldn't turn away. Suddenly, when they were no more than 20 feet from the drone, the video feed cut out. The battery had died. I stared at my phone's blank display. It was at that moment that I realized I hadn't been recording. I swore at myself. It was an understandable mistake considering the circumstances, but I was still frustrated with myself for not getting any proof. Aside from the unexplainable encounter with the creatures, I was now starting to worry that my parents would get upset that I got the drone stuck on its maiden flight. The drone was expensive, and they wouldn't be pleased that it was now wedged in a tree in the forest. I walked sheepishly back into the house. My dad looked up from his laptop and asked if I had a good time. I reluctantly told him that the drone was stuck in a tree, but I promised there was a good reason. I tried to explain my bizarre experience, but my parents simply couldn't accept that I had seen something more than a group of misidentified animals in the fading light. It was frustrating, but how could I blame them? I had a history of letting my imagination run wild, and this was easily the most outrageous claim I had ever made. My dad seemed a little annoyed that I had lost the drone on the first night, but he didn't get angry. He was used to me getting myself into these kinds of situations, and his subtle smirk made me think some part of him appreciated my adventurous spirit. He said we'd go back the next morning to retrieve it. The thought of heading into the forest with those creatures still roaming around terrified me, but I could tell from his tone that it wasn't up for debate. There was no way my dad was going to let me leave a $1,000 drone just sitting in the forest. I slept lightly that night. I knew it wasn't possible that the creatures could have known where I was, but that didn't prevent me from waking up frequently to look out my window into the forest. When morning came, I put on a brave face and headed downstairs for breakfast, dreading the task ahead. As my dad laced up his boots, I reiterated my fears about the unnatural creatures in the woods. I knew he wasn't going to change his mind, but I asked if maybe we could bring a gun just to be safe. He shrugged and made his way into the office to fetch a pistol. I knew he was just humoring me, but I felt a little better knowing that we had a way to fight back if we encountered those things. We made our way into the forest and headed towards the clearing where the drone was stuck. As we moved deeper into the forest, I felt like we were being watched, like something was out there in the trees, but all I saw were birds and squirrels. After over an hour of hiking through the woods, we arrived at the clearing. My adrenaline raced, but there was no sign of the creatures. I spotted the drone in a nearby tree. Fortunately, it was low enough that I wouldn't have to climb very far to get it. I made my way up the tree to the drone and started breaking away branches to free it. As I worked to retrieve the drone, a raspy, guttural howl bellowed out from the forest. It was a primal, unearthly sound, and it sent a chill through my body. Before my dad or I could say anything, there was another howl from a different part of the woods. This one was punctuated with a series of rapid chittering sounds. My dad looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw true fear in his eyes. He drew his pistol and scanned the clearing. He told me to hurry. As I yanked the drone free and started climbing down from the tree, another series of howls pierced the quiet forest air. These were louder and closer than before. My father stared intently into the forest, both hands on his pistol. He said we needed to leave, now! We headed back into the forest towards our house. My dad was moving briskly, seeming to resist the urge to break into a full sprint. His head swiveled in all directions, and he kept a steady grip on the pistol. The otherworldly howls continued, but it didn't sound as if the creatures were following us. When we got home, I could tell my dad was shaken. He told me he didn't want me going into the forest again or flying the drone over that area. I protested and said we needed proof of whatever those creatures were. This could be national news. He looked at me sternly and said I needed to drop it. His response puzzled me. My dad was a curious man, and it seemed odd that he wouldn't want to figure out what these creatures were. But I also sensed he knew something he wasn't telling me. Regardless, I could tell from his face that now wasn't the time to press the issue. I nodded and headed up to my room. I spent the rest of the weekend familiarizing myself with the drone and its recording features. I was determined to get the creatures on video, even if my dad didn't want me to. The next week, when my parents were at work and I was alone at home, I flew the drone back to the clearing. My heart raced as I approached the clearing, but there was nothing there. The fence had been repaired and the creatures were gone. I tried again the next day and the day after that, but I never saw anything aside from the occasional deer. I must have checked the clearing 50 more times over the summer, but I never saw the creatures again. A number of years later, I was back in town on a break from college. I bumped into an old acquaintance from high school at a local bar. As we chatted, the topic of hunting came up. Hunting was a popular activity in our town, and we started discussing our favorite spots. He mentioned that he used to like hunting in the forest near my house. but before he finished his sentence, he trailed off and looked into his beer. I decided to take a chance and relayed the story of my encounter in the forest all those years ago. My friend's face changed as I described the creatures. He glanced around the bar and leaned in close. He told me that he thought he had seen the same creatures once while hunting in that region of the woods. He watched them for a bit through his rifle scope, but when one of their pack noticed him, he ran away and never went back. I asked if he had any idea where the creatures might have come from. He looked around the bar again, then said he had a theory, but I had to swear never to repeat what he was going to tell me. I agreed, and he went on to tell me about a secret government lab not far from our town deep in the forest. It seemed he had an indirect connection to the lab, a family friend who worked on a civilian cleaning crew in the facility. The friend had always been tight-lipped about the sort of work that went on at the lab, but he always thought they were up to some weird stuff. He said the building was always guarded by a number of armed soldiers, and there was a constant stream of trucks with live cargo trailers entering the grounds. At this point, I could see my friend was growing uncomfortable. He wasn't a fan of the government and had always been a little paranoid. Once again, he looked around the bar to ensure nobody had overheard our conversation, then said it was probably best if we didn't talk about it. I could tell he was done with the topic, so I let it go. Still, I wasn't satisfied. There was more to this story, and I suspected my father hadn't shared everything he knew about that terrifying day in the forest all those years ago. The next day, I approached my dad while he worked in the yard. I relayed my conversation from the bar the previous night and asked if there was anything else he could share with me. He stared into the forest. I could tell he was wrestling with whether to reveal what he knew. Finally, he began to speak. At a local barbecue years ago, he met a man who claimed to work as a biologist. The man, who seemed to be somewhere between tipsy and drunk, claimed it was a secret government facility deep in the woods. When my dad asked about the kind of work they did, the man said they specialized in biological research and experimentation. However, he couldn't say anything else, or agents from the Department of Defense would show up on his doorstep. My dad said that was all he knew, and it was the reason he didn't want to get involved and expose what we had seen to the world. Sometimes it was best to stay quiet and not draw attention. He said he knew it might be tough for me to accept, but I'd understand when I had a family of my own. I could tell that our experience in the woods had been weighing on him all these years. I squeezed his shoulder and assured him he had done the right thing. Life went on, and so did my education. My fascination with drones never waned, and I turned it into a successful side business, upgrading consistently to the latest high-tech models. Years later, I was back home while on a break from grad school. My parents had turned in for the night, and I found myself on my back porch, staring into the black void of the forest and reflecting on my encounter in the clearing. I had resigned myself to the fact that I'd probably never solve the mystery. That changed in an instant when a familiar primal howl broke the stillness of the night, sending an icy shiver running down my spine. My heart pounded, not in fear, but in anticipation. It was a call to action, a signal that I couldn't ignore. The creatures were still out there. The truth was still out there, and I was determined to uncover it, no matter what the consequences might be.